Every night, they came to destroy the house that an elderly woman had built with her own hands in the forest. But one day, someone they didn't expect to see appeared beside her. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Anna Lawrence had never noticed how quiet a house could be until the day her husband was buried. Silence had always lived here, tucked between the ticking of clocks and the faint hum of the refrigerator. But now it pressed against her like a heavy, windless sky. After the funeral, people had filled the rooms with soft condolences and murmured phrases that floated past her without touching anything inside. They left behind a faint scent of perfume and coffee. But when the door closed behind the last of them, the silence folded over her again, sealing her in a home that suddenly felt far too large for a single breath. She moved slowly from room to room, not because she had anything to do, but because standing still felt unbearable. Her husband's tools hung neatly in the garage, as they always had. His slippers rested by the bed in their usual place. His reading glasses lay on the nightstand, as if he would return at any moment and reach for them. Yet the bed remained cold, the slippers untouched, and the glasses had gathered a film of dust that had appeared faster than she expected. It was strange how quickly the world tried to cover what was no longer alive. Anna sat at the edge of the sofa that evening, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time in decades, she did not know what the next morning would bring. Her life had always been shaped around another person, her husband's routines, his preferences, the stability he insisted on. He hadn't been unkind, just determined that dreams belonged to youth, and that practicality was the only way adults should navigate the world. For years she had accepted this, folding her own ambitions into tighter and tighter corners until she could barely remember what they once looked like. Now, with nothing left, tying her to the life she had built alongside him, something inside her shifted in a way that frightened her. Unable to bear the stillness, she opened the narrow door that led down to the basement storage room. The air was cool and smelled faintly of stone and old boxes. A single pull-string bulb illuminated the space, casting long shadows against the walls. She hadn't been down here for years. Her husband preferred order, and she had preferred to keep old memories tucked away where they wouldn't provoke arguments. But now, the dust-covered boxes seemed to call to her. She began opening them one by one. Photo albums, winter coats, yellowed newspapers from decades past. Then she saw it, the old cardboard tube, long and battered, leaning against the wall behind a broken lamp. A strange jolt ran through her. She knew instantly what it was, even though she hadn't thought of it in years. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it and carried it to the table. The cap came off with a crack, and when she reached inside, the paper whispered in protest. She unrolled the large sheet across the table. Lines, curved, sweeping. Bold came alive beneath her fingers. It was the house she had designed when she was 23. Not a house, she reminded herself. An idea. A structure that grew out of the earth like a living thing, with walls shaped like roots and windows like hollowed chambers inside an ancient tree. A home sculpted by imagination rather than rules. She had dreamed of becoming an architect, known for challenging the world's expectations. She had dreamed of building something that made people stop and question the boundary between nature and shelter. But that was before she met her husband, before he told her that dreams like this drew ridicule, not admiration. Before she gave up the portfolio, the interviews, the very idea that she could create something extraordinary. Now, standing alone in the basement, she felt the weight of all those silenced years pressing into her. She traced the lines on the paper with the tip of her finger, rediscovering the ambition she had buried. Something stirred in her chest, faint at first, like a long-forgotten ember suddenly touched by wind. She rolled up the drawing again, But instead of hiding it, she carried it upstairs and laid it carefully on the kitchen table. That night, she slept little, drifting between memories and restless thoughts. She dreamed of shapes rising out of the forest floor, of a house that looked as though it had been carved by wind and water rather than human hands. When she finally rose with the pale morning light, she knew exactly where she needed to go. The family owned a piece of land, deep in the nearby woods, untouched for decades. Her father had bought it long ago, imagining he might someday use it for hunting or fishing, but he never had. Anna herself hadn't walked there since she was a girl. But as she stepped under the dense canopy of pines that morning, she felt an inexplicable familiarity settling over her. The forest smelled of damp earth and distant rain, of sap and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. A bird flitted across her path, and the sunlight streaming through the branches painted the ground in fractured gold. When she reached the clearing, the silence shifted. She sensed possibility here. Space not only for building, but for becoming again someone she had once abandoned. She unfolded the drawing and held it at arm's length, imagining the structure rising from the soil. Her heart beat faster. The fear came with it, a quiet whisper reminding her that she was alone, old, and perhaps ridiculous. But the whisper that followed was stronger. If not now, then never. Returning home, she spread out the drawings on the table and studied every angle, every curve. She revised parts of it, merging her younger self's ambition with the experience of the woman she had become. She measured, sketched, redrew. Hours passed without her noticing. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in decades. Within days, she was buying materials. Cement bags stacked awkwardly in her trunk, metal rods tied down with fraying rope, buckets of plaster that she struggled to lift. The store clerk had stared at her as if she were joking, but she answered each doubtful comment with a polite smile. She knew what people saw, a 73-year-old widow with trembling hands and too much time. But inside she felt something entirely different, determination, and a fragile but steady sense of daring. The first days were grueling. She cleared the site with tools that felt heavier than she remembered. Her back ached, her arms shook, and on some evenings, she returned home so exhausted she could barely remove her boots. Yet each time she returned to the forest, something inside her sharpened, focused. Each small progress, a piece of framework standing upright, a patch of ground leveled, fed a quiet, growing pride. Soon enough, the local residents began noticing. They saw her hauling supplies into the forest, disappearing for hours. Some stopped her to ask what she was doing. Others whispered behind her back. 2 men laughed openly one afternoon as she struggled with a wheelbarrow. "Building a palace, Anna?" one of them said, smirking. She forced a small laugh and kept walking, but the words settled like stones inside her. Later that evening, a woman from down the road approached her outside the grocery store. "My dear," she said kindly, almost pityingly, "you should rest. These things are for younger people." Anna only nodded, but when she reached her car, her hands shook not from fatigue, but from a strange mixture of shame and defiance. She drove home, sat at the table, and stared at the drawing until the outlines blurred. That night, she returned to the forest to check her progress. The moonlight cast long shadows across the partially built framework. At first, she thought the crooked beam had fallen on its own, but as she stepped closer, she saw the cut marks. Someone had severed it, leaving the structure dangerously off balance. She stood very still, listening to the forest. In the distance, she heard a branch snap, unmistakably human. A shiver moved across her skin. Someone had been here. Someone had touched her work. She remained in the clearing long after the noises faded, the forest settling once more into silence. And though fear gnawed at her, a deeper certainty settled in her chest. They wanted her to stop. That alone told her she must continue. She returned home with the image of the damaged framework pressing painfully behind her eyes. In the dark kitchen, she unrolled the drawing once more. The line seemed more alive than ever, calling to her with quiet insistence. She rested her hand over the sketch of the front archway, feeling the faint tremble in her palm. She had lost too much in life by giving in to hesitation, by accepting the versions of herself others allowed her to be. Not this time. The next morning, she returned to the woods with tools in hand, determined not to retreat. The broken beam lay where it had fallen, and she spent hours repairing what she could. The work was slow, painful, but each strike of the hammer steadied her resolve. She had no illusions. This would not be easy. The laughter, the doubt, the quiet hostility of the townspeople would not vanish overnight. And now, she realized with a cold certainty, someone had stepped beyond whispers and into action. Someone was willing to sabotage, to destroy what she had barely begun. Yet the fear did not overwhelm her. Instead, it illuminated something she had forgotten she possessed: the courage to build a dream even when the world wanted to tear it apart. And so, beneath the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the quiet breath of the forest, Anna Lawrence continued her work, unaware that her solitary struggle was about to draw the attention of those who would shape her future friends and enemies, both, before her house could finally rise. When she returned home that evening, the forest's shadows lingered in her thoughts. She washed her hands, tense and trembling, and stared once more at the drawing spread across her kitchen table. The house that had once been a dream was no longer a memory. It was becoming something real, something alive, something she couldn't abandon. Not now, not after she had come this far. And in the deepening quiet of her home, as night pressed against the windows and the wind rustled through the trees beyond, Anna felt the first true spark of what her life could still become. The morning after she repaired the fallen beam brought a thin, icy mist that clung to the forest like a reluctant secret. Anna walked the familiar path with cautious steps, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Every twig that snapped beneath her reminded her of the unseen footsteps she had heard the night before. The air felt heavier, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting to reveal whether she would return or finally surrender to the pressure gathering around her. She reached the clearing and stood still for a long moment. The damaged section she had repaired looked fragile in the dim light, a scar on the skeleton of her dream. She stepped closer and ran her fingers across the patched areas. They were solid, holding for now, but the memory of the clean cuts, straight and purposeful, made her stomach tighten. She spent the first hours of the day reinforcing the repaired beam, checking each joint, each screw, each connection. The air was silent except for her steady movements. She tried to focus on the work, on the rhythmic comfort of creation, but her thoughts kept circling the same question. Who had done this? The answer frightened her, not because she feared the person themselves, but because she feared the kind of hatred that drove someone to destroy something as harmless as an old woman's construction. She had not expected hostility, disbelief maybe, mild annoyance, certainly. But the deliberate cruelty felt like a shadow creeping across her path. As the day stretched on, she attempted to silence her worries by burying herself in the task. She mixed cement with stiff, aching arms, adjusted the wooden molds, and steadied the unstable sections of the structure. The air grew warmer, and soon a fine sweat covered her forehead, dripping into her eyes, making the world blur. Yet she continued. Whenever she paused for breath, her gaze drifted toward the tree line, searching for movement she both dreaded and expected. When she finally packed her tools and began the walk home, the forest seemed to watch her go. She kept her shoulders straight, her steps firm, even though part of her wanted to run the entire way. The next morning, sunlight broke through the trees in sharp, bright beams as she approached the clearing. For a moment she felt hopeful, telling herself that perhaps the damage would not return, that perhaps last night had been nothing more than a cruel joke gone too far. But the instant she stepped into the clearing, she saw it. More destruction. One of the metal rods she had set up right yesterday now lay twisted on the ground, stamped with muddy boot prints. Several planks had been pulled away from the base, tossed aside like discarded branches. Her heart clenched. She moved slowly, examining each piece of damage, feeling each cut and break as though it had been done to her own body. She knelt beside the twisted rod and gripped it with both hands. The cold metal stung her palms. Whoever had done this had come after she left, after the forest had grown dark, and the last light from her home had disappeared behind the trees. They had worked quickly, efficiently, and without fear of being caught. Her throat tightened. She sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. The forest rustled around her, indifferent to her grief. She forced herself to stand and began repairing what she could. Her hands trembled, not from exertion, but from the weight of anger and bewilderment pressing down on her. When she hammered a nail, she struck harder than necessary, the metallic clang echoing through the trees. She refused to go home. Not while the damage remained visible. Not while the structure looked wounded and exposed. She worked for hours until her back screamed with pain, until her breath came in shallow bursts. Finally, she straightened, wiped her forehead with the back of her arm, and surveyed what she had managed to fix. It wasn't enough, but it was something. On the way home, she stopped by the small grocery store. She needed nails, a new set of screws, and perhaps, though she did not want to admit it, someone to tell her that she wasn't imagining the malice she felt closing in around her. But the moment she entered, she sensed the shift in atmosphere. Conversations lowered, glances flickered in her direction, and a strange chill settled across her skin. She walked down the aisle, trying to ignore the tension, but then she heard them. Two men near the back, their voices low but distinct. "It's a disgrace," one said. "Building nonsense in our woods. Someone needs to stop her before she ruins the place." "She should have known better," the other muttered. "Widows lose their minds when they get lonely." Anna froze. Her breath lodged in her throat. She stood behind the shelf of canned goods, unable to move. Their words weren't directed at her personally, yet they cut deeper than if they had been. Slowly she lowered a can she had been holding, placed it back on the shelf, and walked out of the store without buying anything. The cold outside slapped her cheeks, bringing tears she refused to let fall. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had lived among these people for decades, exchanging polite greetings, sharing seasonal events, attending neighborhood gatherings. But now she felt like a stranger. No, worse, an intruder. That evening she arrived home drained and defeated. Her hands were raw, smudged with dried cement and dirt. The cracked, exhausted mirror above the bathroom sink showed her a woman who looked older than she felt inside. She washed her face slowly, letting the cool water calm her overheated skin. But the pain beneath the emotional ache remained sharp. She ate little that night. Sleep evaded her. She rose before dawn and returned to the forest at first light, hoping to get ahead of any new damage. But when she entered the clearing, she didn't see fresh destruction immediately. Instead, she saw something worse. Her tools, hammer, wrench, level, and even the small bag she kept nails in were gone. A numbing terror spread through her. She looked around desperately, searching the ground, the bushes, the base of the structure. Nothing. They had taken everything. Her legs weakened, and she sank onto a patch of moss. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. The absence of her tools reminded her just how helpless she was physically. Without them, she couldn't repair anything. She couldn't even defend herself. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Anger rose again, simmering beneath her ribs. She stood and began searching the perimeter of the clearing. The forest floor held faint footprints, several moving in different directions. She crouched and examined them as best she could, though years had passed since she last tried to interpret such signs. But it was clear enough. This had been deliberate, not a single person acting impulsively. Several people had come, moving confidently through the darkness, as if they knew she wouldn't be there, as if they knew she had no one to protect her. She pushed the thought aside and walked the entire boundary of the clearing, circling it once, then twice. Her tools were nowhere to be found. The wind rustled through the trees like a whisper, taunting her. She returned home empty-handed, her eyes hollow, her shoulders heavy. Inside, she collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table and stared at her blueprint. The lines that had once inspired her now felt fragile. Every sweeping curve looked like a promise she could no longer keep. With trembling fingers, she rolled the drawing into a tight cylinder and closed the rubber band around it. She carried it to the hallway closet, the one filled with old coats and forgotten objects. She opened the door and stared into the dim, narrow space. She lifted her hand to place the blueprint inside, but her hand froze. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bury it again. Not after she had tasted the first flicker of what it felt like to create, to reclaim the person she once believed she could become. Her breath shuddered as she stepped back from the closet and lowered the blueprint to her side. She walked back to the kitchen, unrolled the drawing, and smoothed it across the table. She sat down heavily, her eyes tracing the shapes she had once drawn with such certainty. Tears blurred her vision. One slipped down her cheek and fell onto the page, darkening the paper. She didn't wipe it away. Hours passed like that. Outside, the sun climbed high, then dipped toward evening. The light shifted slowly across the blueprint, illuminating different sections, as though urging her not to look away. As the room dimmed, she lit a lamp and continued staring at the drawing. She thought of her younger self, full of dreams, excited by possibilities, aching to build something meaningful. That young woman had been silenced, smothered beneath decades of practicality and compromise. But she hadn't died. She had merely been waiting. By the time night settled fully, Anna made her decision. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, inhaled deeply, and stood. She gathered her coat and flashlight. She was going back to the forest. And whether the saboteurs returned or not, she would meet them with more resolve than she had ever possessed before. She walked the moonlit path with steady determination, the forest glowing faintly under the night sky. The clearing appeared eerily quiet when she arrived, her structure standing like a wounded creature under the pale light. She circled the construction, checking for new damage, but saw none. The night held its breath again. She felt small, her silhouette swallowed by the tall pines, but something inside her hardened. She stood near the frame for a long time, daring the darkness to reveal those who had harmed her dream. She waited until her legs trembled with exhaustion. No one came. Eventually, she returned home, her resolve burning brighter than the fear inside her. Yet the nights that followed brought more destruction. She arrived one morning to find the foundation partially dug up, soil scattered across the clearing, as though someone had deliberately tried to unbalance the structure. Another morning, she found new boot prints circling the site, tracing taunting patterns along the perimeter. One day she discovered a crude, mocking note pinned to a plank with a rusty nail. She couldn't bring herself to read it fully, ripping it away before the words could settle deeply enough to poison her. But the worst came several days later, when she smelled smoke before she even reached the clearing. Her heart pounded violently as she ran the last stretch of the path. Near the base of the construction, a patch of charred wood still smoldered, the embers orange and angry. Someone had tried to set the structure on fire. She hurried to stamp out the remnants, coughing as the smoke stung her throat. Her hands burned as she beat the last glowing cinders into the earth, and by the time the danger was gone, she was shaking uncontrollably. She collapsed onto the ground, staring at the blackened mark scorched into her work. Tears filled her eyes, but the shock held them from falling. She sat like that for a long time, the world spinning slowly around her. She could almost feel her husband's absence beside her, feel the weight of all those years, when she had chosen silence, chosen compliance, chosen to be smaller than she truly was. When she finally returned home that night, she said nothing to anyone. Not because she didn't want help, but because she knew help wouldn't come from the town. These were her neighbors attacking her, her community undermining her. If she spoke out, they might call her paranoid, accuse her of inventing stories to gain sympathy. So she locked the door behind her and walked to the table again, where her blueprint still lay. She unrolled it fully and touched the faint charred marks still lingering in her memory. She thought of giving up. The thought hovered before her like a whisper, coaxing her toward an easier path. But even as her mind wavered, her heart rejected the idea. She remembered how it felt to design the house decades ago, the thrill of imagining something bold and alive. She remembered how it felt, only days earlier, to see the first skeletal shape of her dream rising above the forest floor. Giving up would mean burying that spark forever. It would mean returning to a life made only of routines and empty spaces. It would mean admitting that those who wanted her silent had won. She sat there for hours, staring at the drawing, letting the countless emotions rise and settle. Eventually, she reached out, placed both hands firmly on the blueprint, and whispered into the quiet kitchen, "I won't stop." She didn't know who would help her or how she would protect the structure from further destruction. She didn't know if she could withstand another night like the ones she had already endured. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her dream had been stolen from her. Once. Long ago. She would not let it happen again. Not now. Not at the end of her life. Not when the dream had finally taken shape before her eyes. The forest waited for her. The structure waited for her. Her younger self waited for her. And though she felt painfully alone, she did not yet know that her persistence would soon draw others to her side. People she had never expected, whose presence would transform her lonely struggle into a shared mission. For now, she gathered her tools, wiped the last trace of soot from her hands, and prepared herself to return again at dawn, ready to face the world that wanted her to fail. The next chapter of her life was already approaching through the trees, unseen, uninvited, and quietly unstoppable. The morning after the attempted fire left Anna with a kind of exhaustion she had never known, yet she rose before dawn, as if compelled by something deeper than habit. She prepared herself slowly, moving through the familiar tasks with a heaviness that clung to her bones. She brewed tea but barely tasted it, put on her coat with hands that still carried the faint sting of burned skin, and stepped outside into a world washed in cold blue light. The forest path felt different that day. The shadows were sharper, the silence fuller, as though the woods themselves recognized the battle she was fighting and were waiting to see whether she would continue. Her steps were slower but purposeful. every time she closed her eyes, she saw the violent orange flare of the flames against the structure she had poured so much of herself into. The memory had seared itself into her mind like another wound. When she reached the clearing, she stopped at the edge, her breath catching at the sight of the charred section she had extinguished the night before. Smoke no longer lingered, but the blackened wood stood as a cruel reminder. She moved closer and placed her hand over the burned area, feeling the roughness, the texture that didn't belong. She whispered something to herself, not words of weakness or defeat, but something closer to a quiet vow. She began clearing debris and checking the structure for stability when she heard the distinct crunch of footsteps behind her. Her body tensed. She turned swiftly, bracing for another confrontation with whoever had been tormenting her. But instead of a familiar face twisted with hostility, she saw a young man standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked slightly startled, as if he hadn't expected her to notice him so quickly. He wore a heavy jacket, and the morning light caught the reflective strip on the backpack slung over one shoulder. He raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but cautious. "I didn't mean to scare you. I've seen you out here. I've been curious for a while." Anna stared at him, wary but not fearful. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, with an expression that held more curiosity than judgment. She didn't speak immediately, waiting for him to continue. "My name is David," he said, stepping slightly closer. "I'm an engineer. I'm visiting my parents for a few weeks. I walk through this part of the woods every morning, and—" He hesitated before letting his eyes travel thoughtfully over the structure. "And I've never seen anything like this." Anna kept her gaze on him, still uncertain. "People around here haven't exactly been supportive," she said quietly. He nodded, as if he had expected that. "I've heard some things in town. But what you're building, it's remarkable. I can see the design from here, the intention behind the curves, the way the structure is meant to distribute weight. It's beautiful and ambitious." His eyes returned to hers. "May I look more closely?" Something inside her softened. She gestured toward the structure. David approached with the care of someone who respected both the work and the person behind it. He examined the framework, touching nothing at first, simply tracing the lines with his eyes. After several minutes, he turned back to her. "You designed this?" he asked. She nodded. "It's brilliant," he said simply. "Some parts could use reinforcement, nothing major, just adjustments to support the more organic shapes. But the concept, it's ahead of its time." Anna felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a spark of pride not immediately doused by fear or ridicule. David knelt near one of the beams, examining the way it connected to the curved support. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to a point where the wood had cracked. She nodded again. He pointed. "If we adjust the angle here, redistribute the stress this way, it'll hold much better. And it'll be harder for anyone to damage." "Harder for them," she murmured, her voice fading slightly. He looked at her sharply. "Someone did this, didn't they?" His eyes drifted toward the charred section. "I'm sorry." She didn't reply, but her silence was enough. He stood and dusted his hands. "I can help you strengthen this," he said, "if you'll let me." The offer stunned her. For the first time since she had begun this journey, someone stood before her not to mock, not to threaten, but to help. She studied him, making sure the sincerity in his voice wasn't a trick of her tired mind. "Why?" she finally asked. David shrugged lightly. "Because what you're doing matters. And because sometimes people need someone to stand with them, especially when others are trying to tear them down." Her throat tightened, and she nodded. "All right." And just like that, she was no longer alone. Over the following days, David returned every morning. He brought tools, supplies, and an enthusiasm that spilled into the space between them. They worked side by side in the chilly air, discussing structure, design, and the strange balance between nature and architecture. He asked thoughtful questions about her original ideas, and she found herself remembering details she hadn't thought about in decades. He treated her not as a fragile old woman, but as an equal, a creator worthy of respect. It was during one of these mornings that they heard light footsteps approaching. Both turned, expecting trouble, but instead they saw a girl small, slight, with a long braid falling over her shoulder. She looked no older than 14. She slowed as she approached the structure, her eyes widening with wonder. "It's beautiful," she said softly, almost reverently. Anna blinked in surprise. "Thank you," she said, unsure what else to say. The girl stepped closer, then stopped as if afraid to intrude. "I'm sorry. I've been watching from the trees for a few days. I walk home from school this way. I didn't want to bother you. I've never seen anything like this." David smiled at the girl encouragingly. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, brushing hair from her face. "I like drawing houses, not regular houses, weird ones. My parents say it's silly." Anna studied her for a long moment. She saw in Sophie a reflection of her younger self, quiet, imaginative, yearning to create, but held back by voices that did not understand. She gestured for the girl to come closer. "Would you like to help?" she asked. Sophie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes," Anna said, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. "You have an eye for this, don't you?" Sophie nodded, shy but eager. She spent the rest of the afternoon sweeping debris, carrying small boards, and asking endless questions. Her excitement was contagious. By the time she left, the clearing felt brighter, as though a new light had woven itself into the branches. Later that same week, Anna found an unexpected visitor waiting at the edge of the clearing, a man she recognized vaguely from the neighborhood. His name was Thomas, a veteran who lived alone at the far end of town. He was a quiet man, often seen walking his dog near dusk, always polite but distant. Today he stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the structure with a solemn expression. "I found these," he said without preamble, holding up her missing tools. Anna stared in disbelief. "Where?" "Near the creek," he replied. "Someone dumped them. I thought they might be yours." She took them with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "I thought they were gone for good." Thomas nodded, his face unreadable. "I've heard things," he said after a moment. "Seen things. People walking in the woods at night, not doing anything good. If anyone bothers you again, you let me know." He paused, his gaze drifting to the burned section. "And I'll keep an eye out." Anna didn't know what to say. Gratitude threatened to overwhelm her. Thomas stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You're doing something brave," he said. "Don't let them scare you off." He began visiting every evening afterward, sitting on a fallen log near the clearing, sometimes reading a book, other times simply keeping watch. His presence gave Anna a sense of safety she hadn't realized she desperately needed. A few days later, a fourth visitor appeared, a young biologist studying local plant growth. He had heard rumors about an odd construction deep in the forest and had come to see for himself. When he arrived, he circled the structure with fascination, marveling at the way the curves echoed the natural form of bent branches and eroded stone. "This is extraordinary," he said. "It fits into the environment, almost belongs here. If you use certain natural materials for the outer layers, it could actually support the forest ecosystem." His suggestions opened new possibilities. He explained how certain mosses could grow along the walls, how specific types of bark and stone could blend the structure seamlessly with the landscape. He offered to help her gather the right materials and map out areas where the sunlight hit best. For the first time since she began building, the clearing buzzed with life, people moving, discussing, laughing softly, planning. The fear that had once clung to the space like a dark fog began to lift. Anna found herself smiling at moments she hadn't thought would ever feel light again. She watched Sophie sketch designs in her notebook. She listened as David debated angles and tension points with the biologist. She saw Thomas sitting quietly with his arms crossed, watching over them all like a silent guardian. Together, they worked through long mornings and deep into the afternoons. The structure took shape faster, stronger, more resilient than before. With each day that passed, Anna felt her isolation melting away. She was still the architect of this dream, but now she had hands to help her mold it, minds to help her strengthen it, hearts that cared enough to stand beside her. One evening, as dusk settled around them, the group prepared to leave when the distant sound of branches snapping echoed through the trees. Instantly, Thomas stood, his posture rigid. David stepped closer to Anna, his expression alert. Sophie clutched her sketchbook tightly. The biologist turned toward the sound, his brows furrowed. Then the shadows shifted near the tree line. Several figures stood at the edge of the clearing. Men whose faces Anna recognized, though she wished she didn't. They were the same ones she had overheard in the grocery store, the same who had laughed when she struggled with her supplies, the same who had likely crept through these woods in the dark to sabotage her work. They paused when they saw the group gathered around the structure. Perhaps they had expected Anna to be alone again, vulnerable and defenseless. Instead, they saw her surrounded by people who stood with her, people who would not be moved easily. Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying a warning that echoed through the still air. "If you've come to cause trouble," he said, "you won't like what happens next." The men hesitated, exchanging glances. Their confidence faltered. One muttered something under his breath. Another backed away slightly. And then, without another word, they retreated into the shadows of the forest. The snapping of branches grew fainter until the night swallowed it completely. Anna stood frozen for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. David touched her shoulder gently. "They won't win," he said softly. For the first time since she began her journey, she believed it. As they walked out of the clearing together, the forest no longer felt hostile. The wind no longer whispered threats. Instead, the night carried a newfound sense of unity, an unspoken promise that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Her house was rising. Her dream was breathing. And now, so was she. Morning light spilled through the trees in long golden strands as Anna made her way toward the clearing, and for the first time in months, she did not walk alone. David walked beside her, carrying a toolbox balanced easily in one hand. Sophie followed just behind, clutching her sketchbook to her chest as though it were a treasure. The biologist, whom everyone now simply called Mark, moved with quiet purpose, already scanning the moss-covered trunks to see which species might thrive on the new structure. And Thomas, steady and imposing, brought up the rear, his presence a shield even in the gentle light of dawn. They did not speak much on the walk. They didn't need to. A quiet understanding had settled among them, a bond forged not by obligation, but by choice. The confrontation a few nights earlier had changed something fundamental. Anna no longer felt like a solitary figure beating back the darkness. Now she felt as though the forest itself had accepted her presence, embracing her work with cautious curiosity. And the people who walked with her, these unexpected allies, had become the pillars she leaned on when her strength wavered. When they arrived at the clearing, the structure stood waiting for them like a half-wakened creature stretching toward the sky. The past days of work had transformed it. What once resembled a fragile skeleton now carried weight and presence. The curved supports David had reinforced seemed to flow out of the ground, merging with the earth itself. Sections of the outer walls, molded by Anna's hands and guided by Mark's ecological suggestions, were beginning to blend naturally with their surroundings. Moss and lichen had already crept across some areas, softening harsh edges and giving the impression that the structure had always belonged here. Sophie gasped softly, her eyes wide with admiration. "It's starting to look alive," she whispered. And she was right. Anna felt a tremor of joy ripple through her, the kind that came rarely in life. Unexpected, profound, filling spaces inside her she hadn't known were hollow. They set to work without delay. Over the next several days, the clearing echoed with the sounds of progress. Hammering, sanding, the scrape of shovels, the soft laughter of shared effort. The forest's stillness became a backdrop rather than a barrier. Whenever Anna paused to catch her breath, she would look at her companions and marvel at the strange turn of fate that had brought them together. David moved with precision, his mind always calculating angles, weight distribution, and the most efficient way to strengthen a delicate curve. Sophie worked beside him, carefully following his explanations and adding her own ideas, sketching details that Anna would later incorporate into the structure's design. She had talent, not just the enthusiasm of a child, but the instinct of someone who saw shapes and lines before they existed in the real world. Thomas remained vigilant, always scanning the perimeter, always listening. But he also helped with heavy lifting, carrying beams with ease, and driving thick nails into stubborn wood. His quiet presence steadied the group. As for Mark, he moved like a bridge between the human effort and the natural world. He taught Anna how to blend clay and soil to create a living outer skin for the structure, how to anchor vines that would eventually drape across its upper sections, and how to build shallow crevices where rainwater could gather and drip slowly, nourishing small patches of growth. Under their combined hands, the structure evolved at a pace that surprised even Anna. What had once felt vulnerable, constantly on the brink of being undone, now rose strong and sure, defying the intentions of those who had tried to destroy it. Despite their steady progress, Anna could not shake the memory of the men who had appeared at the edge of the clearing. Their retreat had been a victory. But fear lingered like an unspoken shadow. She knew they might return. She knew resentment did not disappear simply because the odds had shifted. Yet each day that passed without new sabotage eased her heart a little more. Perhaps she dared to hope they were beginning to understand that she would not be frightened away. Or perhaps the sight of her growing circle of supporters had deterred them. But even as that hope blossomed, doubt still lived quietly in her chest. Years of being dismissed, ignored, and underestimated didn't fade so quickly. And still, she did not allow fear to dictate her actions. Not anymore. Not after everything she had endured. She focused on the work, on the rhythm of creation. By the third week of uninterrupted progress, the structure finally revealed its intended form. Standing before it one afternoon, Anna felt a wave of emotion wash over her, so suddenly she had to steady herself. The house, or creature, or sculpture, or whatever it was destined to be, curved upward, like something ancient emerging from the earth. The walls swelled with gentle arcs and hollowed recesses. The windows resembled openings in a cave, yet they invited sunlight in, illuminating the interior with a warm, diffused glow. The doorway arched like the open jaws of some enormous stone animal, but instead of threatening, it seemed to beckon. It was beautiful, unconventional, unlike anything else in the town or anywhere she had ever seen. She rested her hand against the smooth, cool surface. This was her dream made real, shaped by her own hands and strengthened by those who had chosen to believe in her. She felt tears gather, but they were not like the tears she had shed in moments of despair. These were full of pride, gratitude, and a deep, aching sense of arrival. The sense of triumph did not last long. Later that same afternoon, a black truck appeared on the dirt path leading toward the clearing. The sound of its engine shattered the peaceful quiet. Anna felt her stomach tighten as she exchanged a worried glance with David. Thomas straightened immediately, stepping forward instinctively. As the truck came to a stop, 3 men climbed out faces she recognized far too well. They approached with stiff expressions, their eyes flitting between Anna and the structure. One of them, Henry, the owner of the local hardware store, folded his arms across his chest. "We want to talk," he said. His tone carried the same dismissive edge Anna had endured for months. Thomas positioned himself slightly in front of her, not blocking her view, but making his support unmistakable. "Then talk," he said. Henry cleared his throat. "We've spoken with some folks in town. We're calling for an inspection. We think this thing is unsafe. Could be a fire hazard. Could damage the forest. We're not letting some strange, unstable building pop up in our community without approval." Anna felt a flicker of outrage, but before she could speak, David stepped forward. "We've already run structural assessments," he said calmly, "and we're documenting every step. There's nothing unsafe here." Henry's expression darkened. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. We have a right to protect our land." "And she has a right to build on hers," Thomas replied, his voice low and steady. The tension thickened in the air. Anna realized she had been holding her breath. Then, without warning, Mark joined them. "If you're concerned about ecological impact," he said, "you'll be relieved to know that this structure is being designed to support the local environment. If anything, it will benefit the area." Henry scoffed. "You people think you know everything. We'll let the officials decide." With that, he turned and walked back toward the truck. The others followed. The engine roared to life, and the truck rolled away, leaving a cloud of dust behind. When the dust settled, Anna exhaled slowly. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but now you're not alone." She nodded, and for the first time, she truly felt the truth of his words. 2 days later, the inspectors arrived. 2 men and a woman from the regional office. Their presence was formal, their clipped questions giving little away. But as they walked around the structure with their measuring tools, clipboards, and scientific instruments, David spoke confidently about the supports and weight distribution. Mark explained the ecological integration. Sophie showed them her sketches of the planned inner arrangements. Even Thomas, usually silent during such interactions, stood by with an authoritative calm that seemed to discourage any potential dismissal. Anna answered their questions with steady clarity, her voice growing stronger with each explanation. She had designed this structure. She had built it. She understood it better than anyone. When the inspectors left, the group waited nervously for several days. Finally, a letter arrived. Anna opened it with trembling hands. The structure passed with no violations. The inspectors approved the project, noting its uniqueness and ecological sensitivity. Anna closed her eyes and allowed herself a relieved smile. They had won, not through confrontation or anger, but through undeniable strength, knowledge, and unity. With renewed energy, they set to work on the final stages. The outer surface was smoothed, molded, and detailed. Intricate patterns emerged, some intentional, some the natural result of the materials. The interior was crafted into flowing, organic shapes. Shelves arose from the walls like softened ridges of stone. Seating areas formed from gentle curves. Light filtered through carefully placed openings. the house became not just a structure, but an experience, an embrace of nature, memory, and resilience. On the day they finally finished, the forest seemed to hold its breath in reverence. The sunlight struck the structure in a way that made its edges glow with a pale, luminous sheen. Anna stood at the entrance, her heart full and trembling. She invited her friends inside. Sophie gasped in delight. David touched the walls as though tracing the veins of a living organism. Mark marveled at how quickly the moss was beginning to settle in the crevices. Thomas nodded with quiet satisfaction, though Anna thought she saw the faintest smile on his usually stoic face. That evening, as dusk painted the forest in purples and soft blues, Anna sat on the front steps of her completed house. The others had gone home, promising to return soon, promising that this place would not be abandoned to the darkness. She listened to the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the quiet heartbeat of a forest she had grown to love more deeply than she had ever expected. The house behind her, her house, radiated a warm, golden glow from within. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not for who others thought she should be, but for who she truly was. She thought of her younger self, full of fire and dreams. She thought of the years that had dimmed that fire, hidden those dreams beneath the weight of expectation. But now, sitting in the soft night air with the house standing strong behind her, she felt something shift inside her. She had reclaimed that part of herself. She had rebuilt not only a structure, but her own spirit. The forest whispered around her, gentle and approving, as though it too recognized her triumph. Anna Lawrence closed her eyes and breathed deeply, a peaceful smile touching her lips. Her life had been long, but only now did she feel that she was beginning to understand its meaning. The night settled kindly around her, cradling her dream in its vast, quiet arms. And she knew, without doubt, without fear, that what she had built here would endure. If you liked this story, make sure to subscribe and watch the next videos on the channel. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.